Well, maybe we'll start with an introduction and then move into the presentation. I'm Liz Sayre and I'm a Bristol representative. Kristen
Kristen Toy, Starksboro.
and Beth.
I'm Beth McGeorge, Director of Student Support Services at Mountie.
And Mike.
I'm Mike Dash, and I'm a Bristol Select Board or School Board member.
And Barb.
I am Barb Crandall from Moncton, representative from Moncton to the school board.
And Floyd.
I am Floyd Davison. I'm the business manager with MAUSD.
Thank you. And Susan.
And I'm Susan Kleiber, and I'm a Starksboro resident.
Thank you.
Thanks for.
All right.
Okay,
see
so
what Mike's
so
got
yeah, so
for
I'll
us.
go ahead and just get started, and Susan, feel free, or anyone for that matter, to interrupt me at any point. Like, obviously we've got a small turnout here, so we'll be pretty casual. So if there's things I can clarify on the fly, just unmute yourself and throw out questions my way, and I'll do my best to provide a little clarity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see this presentation. Something like that, maybe. We see okay? Yeah, great. I'm just going to clear some of these things so I can actually see there. Okay, great. Look up there, and I'm a huge fan of Zoom, so I'll do my best here. Okay, so thanks. Welcome to Virtual Roundtable. Realistically, what we're going to try to do is give a 15 or 20-minute overview of how we build budgets and how did that look this year as we've now adopted a proposed budget that will be voted on in March. So this is the overall plan for the evening, right? We'll talk a little bit about how these budgets are built and what are the sort of driving considerations that sort of shape those budgets. And then open it up for questions. If it were bigger, we'd have some breakout rooms and things like that. But again, let's be casual given the turnout that we have tonight. So for my part of this presentation, I really wanted to try to capture a couple of key ideas that I think are central to Mount Abe and to the budget that we present and the budget that we use to support our students. And so the first thing that I'll talk about is really just a broad overview, a kind of top-level overview of what does it cost to run a school district? And really, where are those costs allocated? I think we've had lots of discussions as a school board, especially last year with the more contentious budget, where I think there was a lot of uncertainty about where cuts could or couldn't be made. And I think some of that reflected, both from the board and the community as a whole, a lack of understanding of kind of where is the money spent to begin with. So the hope is that I can provide some tools today that we'll have moving forward to try to quickly capture where the budget spends its money. And then using that as sort of a foundation, we talk about how we're going to develop next year's budget, the proposed budget. There, I want to give you a little bit of insight into kind of the process itself, and then some specifics about what was proposed this upcoming year. And then the last thing, just a slide or two about some future considerations. I think I've been on the board now just 2 years. But one thing that's becoming readily apparent is that we can't keep doing the same thing and end up where we want to be. And so I think that'll become apparent in the context of this presentation. And what I'll call for in the last couple of slides is some hopefully optimism and some thought about how can we as a community develop long-term solutions so that we can provide the services to our students that we want, while also doing so at a cost that taxpayers will ultimately support. So that's the plan. So this is often how our district spending is presented, right? A pie chart with lots of numbers that range from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. And I've lived here in Bristol now 11 years, and I think the first 9 years before I joined the school board, my eyes just glazed over when I saw that. I had no way to interpret that. And then the last 2 years, I've tried to interpret this, but it's still really difficult. And I think it doesn't have to be in some ways. If we take this $35 million budget, which represents the budget that was approved by voters last year, we can actually narrow that down into some really basic bins, if you will, of key spending areas. So 71%, give or take, of the budget goes to staffing. Another 13% goes to support of our buildings, either construction or maintenance. 5.5% is just transportation costs. And really only about 10 or 11% of the budget is something other than those three buckets. And so when we think about how we support our students, it's really essential that we understand like what makes up those major costs within the district, right? What does it mean for 71% of our budget to be staffing or 13% to be the buildings? So I have a few slides that hopefully will clarify that. So this is a lot of information, but hopefully it will be readily approachable. So in the middle, there are a couple of pie charts. One is just the number of positions, and the other is the overall budget impact. So that's the cost in dollars of broadly termed the 71% of staffing. And you can see that it's roughly $20 million in direct staffing costs, plus another $5 million in indirect costs that I'm happy to talk about as makes sense. The color of the pie chart, of the pies, if you will, corresponds to this sort of bar graph on the left-hand side. Here, what I'm trying to depict is where staffing is within the district. So as you go from left to right on the screen, that's the number of positions in that bucket. So we currently have 62 core teachers, 23.4 non-core teachers, 16.1 paraprofessionals, and so on and so forth. This is somewhat arbitrary, the way that they're layered in the 4 levels. So if you have issue with that, you can blame me. This was just my way of trying to separate kind of tiers of supports. So the bottom yellow layer I'm roughly calling primary instruction. I would think these are individuals who are in the classroom, in the primary classroom most of the time, and working directly with students. The second would be sort of secondary instruction or support. So maybe often working with students or often working with teachers to provide for support for that frontline instruction. And then we have a category of building administrators and then our central office. And I hope what this slide shows is, one, the extent of our staffing and where we spend that money. But two, a little bit about some of the constraints that we might have when we think about a budget. So for example, there were often comments last year about a bloated central office, right? And I'm not going to take a position one way or the other on that, but I'll point out that the entirety of our central office ultimately comes down to 17.5 positions, or about $1.8 million, which, as we'll see later in this presentation, is about the cost increase of 1 year. All right, so I hope a slide like this shows us that even if we were to take dramatic steps, which may or may not be the right steps, and say cut the central office entirely, that would only be equivalent of about 1 year cost increase. And so again, the goal of this is not to say this needs to be cut or not, but is to give us a foundation for understanding where spending is occurring currently, where have we allocated our supports throughout the district, so that we can make informed decisions as we move forward to future budgets. I'll pause for a second. I don't know if anyone has questions here, or if this feels relatively comfortable.
I do have a comment about central office, because I know there are often questions about that. When the term central office is used, are all of those 17 people located in that building on Munsell Avenue Street?
I don't believe so. And so we do have on the website a breakdown of what those 17.5 positions actually are. Floyd, you might have a better sense of how many of those central admins are actually in the Munsell building.
I do. We have 14 people in the central office building.
Okay, so close.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that that's what some people would assume, that all 17 are there. And, you know, as everybody knows, there's always the question of what do you need those 17 people for? But anyway,
Exactly.
that was just.
But I think it's a really good point, and I hope that what we can see is that those questions, I think, are worthy of discussion, but they also need to be had within the context of the overall financial challenge, right? So even if we were to cut 1 or 2 of those positions, that may or may not really move the needle in the long term.
Right.
And so thinking long term, how are we going to support our students effectively is the sort of idea.
Yeah.
So I think your question's spot on there. Perfect. Okay, so that one slide, however fraught it may be, accounts for 70% of the district budget, right? So to me, this again is a way that we can take a really complex slide, I'll go back, something like this, and really condense it to this is where we as a community and we as a district have decided to allocate our assets, right, to help to best support our students. There are a couple other buckets that I just want to point out as they often come up in the context of a budget discussion. Building costs, which are about 13% of last year's budget. Again, we have a pie chart here that shows a good chunk of those nearly $4.5 million of expenditures come down to construction funds, to maintenance funds of buildings we already have, to custodian and maintenance staff, right? So upkeep of the buildings, and to utilities, right? So $4.5 million, again, it's a really large number, but it can be difficult perhaps to put into context. Fortunately, this year, we had an independent assessment by Truex Collins, architects who assessed the state of all of our facilities across the district. And they prepared a very lengthy report. This is just a quick summary table showing across each of our schools what their perceived needs, if you will, construction needs are. They break these down into priority 1, 2, and 3. So priority 1 are the highest priority needs, and 2 is lesser, and 3 even less so. And they tell us essentially that our buildings have a lot of deferred maintenance and a lot of construction costs outstanding, right? So even if you were to consider just priority 1 costs, Truex Collins estimates a little over $10 million in today's dollars to repair those priority 1 needs. And so maybe to give a little bit more context for where this $4.5 million budget line, 13% of our district spending each year comes from, or you could think about it maybe a little bit more directly as the 1.7 million and the 420,000 of maintenance, if you want to be generous. So roughly $2 million dedicated to our buildings directly. At that level of funding, it would take us 5 years to do the priority 1 needs, 19 years to take care of all of priority 2 needs, and something like 35 years to do priority 3, right? So while in the discussions about the budget, we might often turn to something like a construction line and say, well, do you really need $1.7 million? I think an assessment like this at least puts into context why we as a board and administration have proposed such funds given the needs of the district itself. Just as an additional piece of information that'll come back a little bit later in the presentation, we have also been building up, I think over the last 10 years or so, a bit of a capital reserve fund. So these are funds directly to support pressing construction needs within the district. And currently there's about $1.7 million in those capital reserve funds. So in terms of the current budget, 70% is staffing, another 13% is building. I have no fancy things here other than a picture of a bus from the internet, right? We spend about $2 million to get our kids to school, which seems pretty important. So that again is a big fixed cost of about 5.5%. One that the district has taken strides to mitigate in terms of how we bid out for contracts, now regionally bidding, but nevertheless, it's a cost that we need to foot. The last bucket in the current budget that I think is worth talking about is sort of other expenses, and again, this is roughly 10% of our total district spending, so not an insignificant amount at a little over $3 million. Here in the pie chart, you can see the sort of breakdown of what we're calling other expenses. These are things like technology and food services, professional services, athletics, co-curricular. But I want to point out that even in this context of calling these other expenses, much of this comes right back to staffing. So when I look at these expenses, professional services captures unemployment insurance and workers' compensation, right? These are costs that are directly related to supporting our staff. Within this $705,000 of the tech budget, something close to $200,000 of that are staff that help support that area. Athletics or co-curricular would be coach and leader stipends. And of course, the professional development is how we help ensure that our staff are trained and have the latest information so they can do their jobs as best as they can. So even in this bucket of other, again, a large portion of what we're spending our expenses on within the district go directly to support the people who are then supporting the students.
I have a question
Yes, of course.
going back to construction.
You-
Where did Truex come up? How did they come up with what they felt were the needs? Were they provided lists? I mean, how did they know Mount Abe needs a new roof? Or did they assess the kind of condition of each building, and this building needs a new furnace and this needs new windows? How was that determined?
Yeah,
How did
exactly.
they? Yeah.
It was a direct independent assessment. So they worked with the district and then they visited each building and poked around and prodded around to come up with their assessment of needs. Floyd, I don't know if you want to add any context to that.
I'm happy to. I think that they were, one nice thing is Truex we've worked with them on some of our projects, so they're familiar with a lot of our infrastructure already, which was one of the reasons why we moved forward with them in this assessment. They leaned heavily on the state structure as well to look at what the state guidelines are around this. But truly, it came right down to looking at each individual building and each of the areas and what the need was and expected life still out there. When you look at a priority 1 item, those are all items that have exceeded their expected life and are failing or near failing, right? And then priority 2 is near the end of its life but still working. Priority 3 are items that should be put into a replacement schedule. None of those are pie in the sky items, right? They're really about the deferred maintenance that we have been not Mount Abe individually, the whole state has been has found difficulty in finding the funding to take great care of their buildings. And as if you take a look at the presentation that Truex gave to the board around this, they were pretty forthright with their view that we're in much better shape than most other districts. So we have done a pretty good job of taking care of our infrastructure, our needs for our students, and we're still $10 million in the hole out of the gate.
And 2 more questions. Presumably, just using Robinson as an example, priority 1, $650,000. I assume that there's a list somewhere that says it's the furnace and it's a roof over this part and it's 4 doors or whatever it ends up being. That there's essentially an itemization of.
Yeah, I'm happy to send the whole thing over to you, Susan. It's pretty impressive the depth that they go into with everything. So yes,
Yeah.
there definitely is. Yeah, I'll send that over to you.
Okay, and then one.
And it is available on the website, Susan. You can go take a look at it anytime.
Okay, that's fine. And one more question. The column that says replacement cost, again, you're just using Robinson as an example. To replace Robinson completely, it would be 23.5 million.
Exactly.
Is that what that means? Okay.
Yeah, and then the reason they provided that was, if you look at the last column, this FCI, that's just a ratio of the total outstanding costs for that building relative to the replacement cost. So basically saying, if you were to pay for everything to fix that they've identified, what % of the just building a new school essentially would that be?
Yep.
And so it kind of gives you a sense of like kind of the overall health or well-being of individual buildings. It doesn't necessarily tell us what we should or shouldn't prioritize, to be very clear,
Sure.
but gives us that kind of relative ratio.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great questions. Okay, perfect. So with that, I hope that we have a kind of a clear sense of, we have a budget, we have pretty big buckets in which most of our expenses go to. So the question becomes, how do we get from last year's budget to a new budget? So here I'm going to give just a little overview of the process and then dive into really quickly some quick details about this proposed budget. So the initial budget development always starts with our district administration, and they start with the current budget. And I think the first thing that tends to happen is Floyd and Patrick and others identify new constraints, right? What are going to be the challenges that we face that weren't in place the year before, but now are in place for our next year's budget? So these things can be legislative, right? So for example, there's a new tax calculation formula in terms of how, I'm blanking on it, the assessed value of our houses are factored into the tax calculation. We need to take into account like negotiated salary increase, inflation, cost of goods, statewide healthcare premiums for our educators, which again are negotiated outside of our district. That goes up 11.9% for next year. We have to take into consideration the pupil count, right? So every year the state assesses a sort of weighted pupil count, and that helps determine funding for the district. And lastly, we have to take into account the statewide yield. So even though we have some degree of local control over our own budget, the ultimate impact on our taxes is a factor or is a combination of both our proposed spending, but also the yield, which is driven by the total spending across our state. So the district administration identifies those constraints to understand what kind of challenges we might face as we head into the next year. I think at the same time, the administration reassesses our needs and our wants, right? This budget isn't built just to meet the numbers, it's built to meet the needs of our students, right? So this could be thinking about class sizes and what kind of student supports we need or might want to shore up. It might thinking about what kind of programming we have or might want to have. And then of course, facilities, building needs. So the administration takes all of that into account, the constraints, the needs, and the wants, and they bring an initial budget proposal to the school board and the community, presented at a school board meeting. At this point, it really opens discussion, right? So that we can understand where that sort of initial proposed budget might have come from. We can better understand the constraints and needs of the district and provide feedback to the administration based on what we hear. After this open discussion, at least in the last couple of years, the board has typically provided a projected tax impact for the administration to meet. Essentially, the board says, okay, we hear the challenges, we hear the needs, but we also hear from our constituents challenges that they're facing with rising property taxes. We think that this is the number that we'd like you to see a budget produced to try to do all of these things, right? Maintain tax rates at a level that's acceptable for our constituents, also meet the constraints that are coming, and also meet the needs. This year, based on the presentation that we saw, the board set a somewhat ambitious target in which we thought we'd like to see a budget in which none of the 4 towns would expect to see an increase in their property tax. In other words, the highest increase would be 0% felt by any one of our towns. Once we set that target for the administration goes back to the proposed budget. They incorporate feedback from us and the community and that new budget target, assess the constraint, wants, and needs, and come back again to the board with a new budget. And we repeat that process until the board votes to adopt a proposed budget. So what did this look like for our proposed budget that the board has recently adopted? Some of the constraints that we face that made getting to a 0% tax increase quite challenging are a lower student count. So there's a long-term weighted average. It's a measure that the state provides that takes into account the number of students in attendance across our district, but also weights those students based on perceived need, right? So this could be a variety of factors like English as a second language, socioeconomic status, how rural the school district is. The state then has a formula that builds in all of those factors, takes the number of students that fit each of those categories, and comes out with a number that is our long-term weighted average. And it's worth noting in the context of this that just based on changing enrollment patterns and who's enrolled in the district, we saw a relatively large decrease in our long-term weighted average, something like about 40 some pupils, making it harder to support the students that we have while spending the same amount, because that drives up costs. Again, worth pointing out, year-over-year increases, right? So whether this is salary and benefits, right, whether it's the 11.9% increase in healthcare across that statewide, or whether it's our own negotiated agreements with our support staff and our professional staff, we're seeing about an increase between this year and projected for next year of about $1.9 million in new expenses. And the administration also informed us that they expect a bit less revenue from the state and from in general as a result of fewer students paying tuition, less special education funds. So armed with those constraints, the administration had to go back and find a way to get a 0% increase by offsetting these additional expenses. Ultimately, it meant the admin needed to reduce spending by about $2 million, give or take, to meet the ambitious board target of 0%. How might an administration look at the current budget and then find $2 million, right, to meet that offset? I think, again, it comes back to where do we spend, right? If we spend 71% in staffing or 13% in buildings or 5.5% in transportation, a big chunk of the spending, if we're going to reduce spending, is likely to come from the places where we spend most of our money. So that's what the administration has proposed and the board has subsequently adopted. We have reduced staffing costs by about $830,000. We've done this without issuing any RIFs, reduction in forces. How have we done this? We've merged an administration position in central office. There was a vacancy, so now that 2 positions are going to be 1. There were 6 professional staff positions that were allocated in the budget for the current year, but because of difficulties in finding employees, right, difficulties in hiring, those 6 positions were unfilled for the entire year. This is a social emotional learning coach, some interventionists, and 1 school-based clinician. So basically, those positions were cut from the proposed budget as they weren't filled in the current budget. Additionally, due to a recent retirement, the new budget proposes eliminating 1 K-6 teacher, again, just not filling in a position following retirement. Other areas of saving to some extent, last year's budget, we had reduced the construction line by $400,000 to try to reduce the impact on people's property taxes. We had discussed at length perhaps adding that back to the construction budget this year, given the needs expressed by Truex Collins. But in order to meet that 0% target, this budget does not add back that $400,000 into the construction budget. And the administration went line by line and based on also special education transportation costs, tuition to vocational schools and private schools, we're able to reduce some of those other costs by a little over $660,000. It's important to note that when you take those constraints on the previous slide and you take these changes that are proposed in the budget, we end up with a situation or a proposed budget that doesn't produce any anticipated changes to school programming. So the same courses and opportunities should be present for our students. Class sizes will be well within district guidelines, so that doesn't change. We were not in a position where we're issuing reduction in force notices, essentially telling people who had a job that they no longer have a job. And the administration was able to come up with a budget that produces a 0% or less tax increase in each town, Again, that's predicted. That's predicted with the best information that we have right now. As things statewide move, it's unclear exactly where we'll end up, but this is the case every year. What does this look like, dollars and cents for the proposed budget? We propose a budget that's a little under $35 million, which is a decrease of almost $500,000 from last year's budget, which, given the constraints that we talked about a few slides earlier, represents a pretty significant savings when everything else is costing more. Again, we talked about a little bit of a decrease in expected revenue. That's pretty much on par with that change in total expenses. That combined means that our total educational spending, which is just our expenses minus revenue, is going to be a little bit less in the proposed budget than it was the previous year, of about $27,000. Because we have a smaller long-term weighted average, our pupil count, when you then take the educational spending and adjust that by the per pupil count, our proposed budget will increase per pupil spending by about $300 or 2%. And I give all that information because now that is mandated to be part of the ballot that you'll see, the article that you'll vote on. So that's where all of those numbers come from. All that being said, because of a new formula and the way that assessment is being worked into our costs and also the projected yield, that small increase in per pupil spending is predicted to translate to a reduction in property taxes across the 4 towns and for those who are paying their income-based tax rate based on their household income. So that's what this chart shows. It shows the current tax rate, the proposed budget, again, an estimate, the change for each of those towns, how much that would equate to in a dollar value. So you read this as per $100,000 of the assessed value of your home. Bristol would expect to see, if this held true, an $80 reduction in taxes for each $100,000, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'll pause there with our proposed budget. Perfect. So 2 last quick slides. I want to both point out, right, how complicated it is to go from a budget to a proposed budget, and that I'm optimistic that we as a board and as a community and as administration have been able to navigate this process this year in a way that supports our students, but is cognizant of the increasing financial burden that taxpayers are feeling. But I think I'd like to sort of call for us to have broad vision. You'll see that the school board and the district as a whole will be hosting lots of meetings and opportunities to provide feedback as we all collectively grapple with how do we successfully fund education in the state moving forward. And so I'd like to spend just 2 slides thinking about future considerations. The first is the sort of paradoxical immediate future consideration. I think it bears repeating. In the Truex-Collins report, and something that we've known as a district for many years at this point, there are some really pressing needs, and perhaps the most pressing of those is a new roof at the high school and middle school building. So from Truex-Collins, they point out that extensive patching of the roof membrane was noted at the original building. All membrane roof areas are at the end of service life and should be replaced. And that's probably generous, given that it's not even clear if that roof has ever been fixed or replaced since it was installed in, I think, 1969, which is a very long time for a roof. So given that pressing need, there are 2 additional ballot articles that our community will get to vote on this March that really speak to how we as a district or how we as a board have proposed to be able to address this pressing facilities need. The first article, which will be Article 10 on the ballot, would authorize the use of up to $1,040,000 from the Capital Reserve Fund to help pay for the new roof at Mount Abe High School. Any inflow to the Capital Reserve Fund or expenditure of the Capital Reserve Fund has to be approved by the electorate. So we come to the electorate to ask for permission, if you will, to spend that money on the roof. The second article, oddly enough, tries to put money back into the capital reserve fund. So we just received our audit from the year 2024, from financial year 2024, and there was an audited fund balance of almost $820,000. So Article 11 asks for permission from the electorate for the board to be able to deposit the entirety of that $819,990 back into the capital reserve fund as a way to have essentially a rainy day fund for future facilities needs. Now, many of you out there might be thinking, why on earth would you take money out of the fund and then also put money back into the fund? And it's a little bit silly, but I think it's really important that we take this approach, or that at least we present this approach. The reason why we need to have this sort of two-step process is that as part of those new statewide legislation, there is a new tax that has been implemented that would cause any funds in a capital reserve fund that are over 5 years old to then be taxed against the district. So by taking the money out to pay for the roof and then essentially replenishing that money with our 2024 fund balance, we essentially accomplish two really important goals. We have the money available to help support that really important facilities need, and we avoid the potential tax on money that's been in the capital reserve fund for over 5 years by putting that money in anew. So those are the sort of immediate future considerations that you as the electorate will have the opportunity to vote on in March. Yes, Susan.
How much is in the capital reserve fund right now? And I understand the taking out of $1 million, but right now, what's the approximate total?
About 1.7 million.
Okay.
And so the end result, if both of these were approved, is that the capital reserve would end up a little lighter than it was right now, but close to $1.5 million.
Right. And also the roof on the high school, middle school, this says that the $1,040,000 is to help pay for. What's the total estimated cost for the roof, and where does that other money come from?
Yeah, perfect. So that's a great question. So we don't have, I would say we don't have a final estimate, but it feels like ballpark. We're in, and depending on the scope of the project, we're looking at like $1.5 million to $2 million, it sounds like. And by scope of the project, I mean, if we wanted to think, for example, long-term and thought we might end up putting solar panels on the roof, we would want to structurally support the roof to be able to do something like that, which would drive up costs. If, however, we decided that wasn't a long-term goal, then the bottom line of that project would be a bit lower, if that makes sense. In terms of the other money coming from, the other money would be able to come from construction funds that are allocated as part of the regular budget.
Got it. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great question. So those are the immediate future considerations, is the roof. But again, the last thing I would like to point out is I think we're in a place as a district and frankly as a state where we really need to start thinking about long-term solutions. And so this is an oversimplification for sure, but hopefully a useful one. If we think about this proposed budget this year, that's going to keep taxes flat or provide a small decrease, depending on how it shakes out town to town. In order to accomplish that, essentially what this budget had to achieve was offsetting about $2 million of increased costs by cutting about $2 million from somewhere else in the budget. And on a $35 million budget, that's cutting 5 to 6% of the budget in a given year. I mean, maybe I'm short-sighted in this. I find it very difficult to believe that we can continue to take that approach, where you're cutting 5% of the resources that you've allocated to support our students just to maintain tax rates at a level that some probably feel are too high already. And so this is maybe just a call that while we're talking about the current budget now, and I'm sure we will continue talking about the current budget all the way through this budget season up to the vote in March, just to be on the lookout that we as a board and as a district will very quickly be transitioning into thinking long-term and really leaning on the community for their voices, for their support, and for their ideas as we collectively try to understand how do you do this in a way that's sustainable, that isn't just cutting bits and pieces to keep the status quo, but rather is forward thinking and trying to improve on what we already have and provide even better services for our students long term. So that's the plug for stay tuned to the current budget, but please also have an eye on what we might do in the future, because that's coming sooner than later for sure. Okay, that essentially is where I end a presentation. I think if we had more turnout tonight, we'd set up some discussions, and hopefully we'll provide some other opportunities for that in the future. But Susan, if you or others have other questions sort of about the presentation, I'm happy to entertain them.
I have just one comment, and it's really a comment rather than a question, but also looking at the future. And I'd be interested maybe in hearing from Beth McGeorge. I'm concerned about balancing the budget on the special ed, the lack of special ed personnel, unless there isn't a need for them. I mean, if there's not a need, that's a fine place to cut. But if there is a need, the emphasis should be on more advertising and training and whatever to get more special ed personnel if they're needed. And so I'm concerned about, not to be cute about it, but balancing the budget on the back of special education.
Right. And I don't feel that's the case. We are looking for a special educator now. We have one virtual, so we're constantly looking for special educators. That being said, most special educators right now case manage about 13 to 15 students, which is very manageable. And what's unique about us right now, because of Act 173, the MTSS, we service students with our interventionist as well. So special education and interventionist are sharing students. So that has really helped with special education. We certainly have some work to do, but I feel like we're in a good spot. We just can't find people to fill the position. So we keep advertising. Like I said, we did try virtual. It is working for some students. There's a very select few of students that would honestly rather work with a remote teacher than have one sitting right next to them, and that's been okay. But that's been our biggest challenge is filling the positions that we have.
Right. And I understand that, and I think I'm sure you're doing the best that you can with what there is. But as I say, long term, I would express a concern about that. But
yeah,
you're doing what you can. I understand.
Yeah.
I'll jump in, and I don't think from a high level standpoint, we're certainly not balancing this budget on the backs of our special ed piece. And I would add that the staffing issue isn't unique to MAUSD, right? It's not unique to Addison County. It's throughout the state, and to a large degree, it spills out over the whole country to find qualified individuals to become part of your team. And our cost here in this state is expensive, right? We know we're losing that demographic of that entry level teammates to other states because they can't find housing, for example, or any number of reasons. So we as a state are struggling to find enough people to fill positions. Having said that, I think Beth has done a spectacular job of making the best of the situation we have work for those kids, right? That's the bottom line is, are we providing and supporting our students that need that support? And I would say without reservation, we do that exceptionally well within the constraints that we're working under. We can't find subcontractors, right? Some
Right.
of the the agencies aren't able to staff to be able to help us.
Right. Thank you.
Yep. And thanks, Susan. I think those are really important sort of long-term considerations though too, right? Which is as we think about wants and needs and changing needs, both of our students and our professional staff, right? How do we incorporate that into a long-term solution? And I think that's exactly the right kind of forward thinking that we're going to need as we think about what we're doing now as best we can, and also what we'll need to do 5 years or 10 years down the road.
Yeah, again, not to get into a long discussion, but I'm somewhat familiar with zero-based budgeting and wondering if that's kind of an approach that needs to be considered, as opposed to starting with last year's budget and figuring out how we can move around last year's budgets, that we look more at, starting from zero and how many languages can we afford to teach, or how many classrooms can we have in a certain school, those kinds of things. But again, that's a long-term vision sort of thing.
And I'll address that briefly. I think that to a large degree, we're doing those two items parallel, right? We may not be starting at a zero, but we don't necessarily need to. We know we're going to need X number of math classes. So that is a good example of we can zero base on items that we can zero base on. Mike pointed out earlier that we went through the 1,100 lines of that budget and scrubbed it, right? Anything that we didn't think we needed anymore, we took out. Mm-hmm. There's a great sense of accomplishment in what we've been able to make happen this year. And to Mike's point, there's some wood to chop going forward because we can't do this again. Right. Once you're down to once you've combined as many positions as you can, you start to run out of opportunities to do any more. The reality is that the state requires us to fill out an awful lot of forms, and I would be remiss not to throw a great kudo to our accountant. We're a $35 million company with one accountant who does a spectacular job for us and holds that all together. And she's great, but I would be surprised to find many other companies of this size, this many funding sources, this many expense lines, doing it all with one accountant with the oversight that the state puts us through in terms of reporting, right? But I think you already know all those things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Susan, thank you again for joining us, and obviously thanks to community engagement for setting this up, and to Floyd and to Beth for your time tonight. I think our plan is to have a video recording at least of the presentation, so that if others in the community want to sort of access that at the high level, we can. I can make slides available on the website as well, and we're working on finalizing the budget flyer that will be mailed out to everybody shortly. That again will kind of capture the same sort of essence of part of this presentation.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.
Good to see you, Susan.
Good night.
Good night.